Okay, so we'll just start assessing a motivation for the session, thinking about how we want to receive the precious alignment teachings, for the motivation of not just ourselves alone, but also for the benefit of all sentient beings. How we need to become a Buddha to liberate all sentient beings. And to do that, first we need to develop renunciation, bodhicitta, and the correct view of emptiness. So based on that, we start a set of motivation, thinking, we'll listen to these teachings with this intention of studying and then applying to practice to become a Buddha to benefit these beings. So then think in the space in front of ourselves. There is Shakyamuni Buddha sat on a lotus and moon seat, and he's surrounded by the 17 Pandits of Nalanda, the 84 Mahasiddhas, or the sort of masters of the various lineages, the Tibetan tradition or the Chinese and Japanese traditions, or anything you kind of practice. And these are all sat in front, and the stupas and so on, representing the Buddha's holy mind and so on, the Dharma represented in scriptures if you want. And think they're all there, and surrounding yourself with all sentient beings in the aspect of humans. And think we're going to lead them in the prayer so they can also join us by progressing along the path to enlightenment. So we shall do the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha first. Guru, teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, perfectly complete Buddha, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, Siddhartha of the world, supreme guide of beings to be subdued, teacher of gods and humans, to you, Buddha Bhagavan, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Guru, teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, perfectly complete Buddha, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, Siddhartha of the world, supreme guide of beings to be subdued, teacher of gods and humans, to you, Buddha Bhagavan, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Guru, teacher, Bhagavan, Tathagata, Arhat, perfectly complete Buddha, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, Siddhartha of the world, supreme guide of beings to be subdued, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, Buddha Bhagavan, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Then recite the mantra Shakyamuni Buddha 7 times. Tayatha Om Muni Muni Maha Muni Ye Soha. Tayatha Om Muni Muni Maha Muni Maha Muni Ye Soha. Tayatha Om Muni Muni Maha Muni Maha Muni Ye Soha. Tayatha Om Muni Muni Maha Muni Maha Muni Ye Soha. Tayatha Om Muni Muni Maha Muni Maha Muni Ye Soha. Tayatha Om Muni Muni Maha Muni Maha Muni Ye Soha. And then rather than reciting the entire Heart Sutra, we'll just recite the verse praise to the perfection of wisdom. Ma sam sho mi shera palji, ma ke mi ganam ke nyo ni, so so rang ye shi cho yo wa, tu sung gya wa yom la jat se lo. And the mantra of the Prajnaparamita 3 times. Tayatha Om Gati Gati Paragati Parasamgati Bodhi Soha. Tayatha Om Gati Gati Paragati Parasamgati Bodhi Soha. Tayatha Om Gati Gati Paragati Parasamgati Bodhi Soha. And then the short mandala offering. To think you're requesting these teachings from Shakyamuni Buddha himself. And he's then very pleased with this. Om Sashibogi Yoshimeto Tamirabli Nide Gembadi Sangye 신두 믹세보 도그나 다신나 조파쇼 jetsun lama dampa khenam hi shoku kala kien se shu zin tri jita shambhe tu jin mala zage shoki cha vadu so idanku vanamandala kane atayami. In refuge. Sangye chodam soni chonam la chanchu padu dani kapsu chi dagi jinso yipe sonami jola penche sangye rupo sho sangye chodam soni chonam la chanchu padu dani kapsu chi dagi jinso yipe sonami jola penche sangye rupo sho sangye chodam soni chonam la chanchu padu dani kapsu chi daki jinso kipe sonamki trola penchu sangye rupo sho. Okay, so then continue from where we left off in the last session. So going through the text by Lama Tsongkhapa, the three principal aspects of the path. And in the last session, we went through the beginning of the text, focused on the introduction verses up to and including verse 2, I believe we went. So yeah, we completed verse 2, so we did the expression of homage, the promise to compose, and the persuading to listen. So these we kind of covered, focused on mainly why we need to study this text. So I was reading this week a few different things, but there was a little comment made by Kenshin Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche, the great Turton of Lamgar in Tibet. And he's well known because among revealing many great termas and having meeting bodhisattvas like at Mount Wutai Shan in China, so the border of China and Tibet, he saw Manjushri, and this is said to be Manjushri's Pure Land. But he's also known for having had a vision of Lama Tsongkhapa and receiving teachings from horrific visions. And in this comment, Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche explained that if you have the ability and the time studying the extensive Lamrim texts by Lama Tsongkhapa, like the Lamrim Chenmo or the Lamrim Bring, the middle-length Lamrim, is very good. But if you don't have time and you just need the pith instructions, you should study the three principal aspects of the path or the Song of Experience. So we can see how important it is to understand this text and to apply it to our daily life, because it's a very short, condensed text and everything's applied to practice. So we're going to start into the sort of main body of the text. First one we're focusing on is first of the three principal aspects is renunciation. And for all three sections of renunciation, bodhicitta, and emptiness, there's kind of three main points. There's the first point, which is why we need to generate that particular aspect. The second is how we generate it. And then the third is how do we know whether we've generated it or not. So to start from the text in verse 3, it says, without the complete intention, definitely to be free from circling, there is no way to pacify attachment seeking pleasurable effects in the ocean of circling. Also by craving for cyclic existence, embodied beings are continuously bound. Therefore at the very beginning, seek renunciation. So Lamson Kappa, this final line is really emphasizing the importance that without developing renunciation, we cannot really practice the Dharma. We don't really we can't enter into any of the paths, whether it's the Pratyeka Buddha vehicle, the Sravaka vehicle, or the Bodhisattva vehicle. You cannot enter the grounds and paths without realization of renunciation. So here we're saying without the definite complete intention to be free from circling. So renunciation, this is what it is. It's not just giving up on things, it's not just abandoning food, like friends, family, our homeland, jobs, clothes, becoming a monk, running away and becoming a monk, anything like that. Well, like being an ordained monastic, it's very good and very pure renunciation. The renunciation we need to develop, and the monastics aim to develop, and we as lay people should aim to develop, is an internal sense of renunciation. Not just thinking how to avoid the externals of samsara, but also the kind of internals. We have no grasping at cyclic existence. We don't want this, we don't have this interest in craving for things. So if we lack this pure renunciation, we're focused on the worldly concerns. And when we focus on the worldly concerns, there's no way to attain liberation. So therefore, we need to understand that the liberation comes from this renunciation. So therefore, we'll generate renunciation. So then, on to how we actually generate renunciation. And verse 4 says, freedom and endowments are difficult to find, and life has no time to spare. By gaining familiarity with this, attraction to the appearance of this life is reversed. By thinking over and over again the actions and their effects of unbetraying, and repeatedly contemplating the miseries of cyclic existence, attraction to the appearances of future lives is reversed. So here this verse 4 can be split into two, basically. And the first one is about this life. Renunciation, we can't just jump straight into the deep end and think we want to be permanently out of samsara. We need to start with, I don't want suffering in this life. So then we start off by thinking about the freedoms and endowments, because this is the very first line. Freedoms and endowments are difficult to find. So we're saying that this precious human rebirth with the 8 freedoms, freedom from being born in the hell realms, from being born in the hungry ghost realm, from being born an animal, from being born as a long life god, from being born when a founder Buddha has not appeared, from being born in a place with no dharma, from being born with defective senses, and from holding wrong views. So these are the 8 freedoms that we have. Or that we're all here as humans. I don't know if there's any non-humans in the room, but those on Zoom are human. Then a founder Buddha has appeared, because Shakyamuni Buddha, a great teacher, has appeared. We are free from being born in a place with no Dharma, because we have the possibility to hear the Dharma. We don't have defective senses in that we can read and understand the teachings and listen and so on. And we don't hold wrong views. So while we don't have the perfect right view of emptiness and so on, because then we'll be a Buddha, but we don't hold a wrong view in that we are convinced that there is an eternal self or soul and that karma doesn't exist. Because if we really were convinced like this, you wouldn't come to teachings and practice the Dharma. And then the 10 endowments are split into 2, the personal and the circumstantial. So the 5 personal endowments are being born as a human, being born in the centre of a religious country, being born with a well-functioning body and mind, not having committed the 5 heinous crimes, and having faith in the Dharma. So as you can see, they're basically the opposites, or the following on from these freedoms. It's whereas being free is you're not in that situation. The endowment is you have the opposite. You have this positive aspect. And again, with the 5 circumstantial endowments, it's being born in a fortunate period where the Buddha's appeared. This Buddha has taught the Dharma. This Dharma still exists and is flourishing. And we're able to meet with purity followers of these teachings. And being born in a fortunate period where practitioners can enjoy kind support. So we can see in that way, basically these are all linked. If you have the 8 freedoms, you also have the 10 endowments. They just come from different, being compiled from various different teachings. So then the second line says, and life has no time to spare. So this relates to the practice of impermanence, thinking that it's certain we'll die, that it's uncertain when we'll die, and that when we die, nothing except the Dharma will be of benefit. So there's the 9-fold meditation on death we can use here, where we start off by saying, it's certain we'll die, because there's no way to ward off the Lord of Death. The second one is your lifespan cannot be increased and constantly diminishes. So every moment, is a step towards death. We're constantly just moving towards death. There's no real way to push back our eventual death forever. It must happen. And you can die without having had time to practice the Dharma while alive. So it's not the case that if you just don't practice the Dharma, you'll live forever. It eventually will happen. Then the next set is related to the time of death is uncertain. So the first one saying there's no certainty with regards to our lifespan. It's not like when you're born, there's a printout you're given that tells you you'll live 80 years. Because you might live to old age and you might live to 80, or you could have an accident and die young. There's no way of being certain. And the second is that there are many conditions of death and few conditions of life. We can see how fragile the human body is. So easy to die. Even what's the cause of life can be a cause of death if you have just too much or too little. Too much food and you can get ill and die. Too little food and you can starve. And the same with water and even, less so with air, but more so if you think about oxygen. If you have too much oxygen, you get sick. If you have too little, you die. And the third one for this one is that the body is extremely vulnerable. The human body is quite fragile. It's very easy to break and damage. And then the final one is to do with the time of death, nothing except the Dharma will be of benefit. And this has 3 aspects. You cannot take your friends along with you, you cannot take your possessions along with you, and you cannot take your body along with you. You have this subtle mind which moves from life to life. Your possessions, when you die, you just leave them behind. You can't take them with you. And your family and friends cannot help you at the time of your death. They can maybe light butter lamps and read various prayers, but the main influence on our rebirth when we're involved in cyclic existence is our own karma. So in that way, there's not a lot they can do. It's all down to ourselves. So by gaining familiarity with this means constantly meditating on and contemplating the meaning and gaining confidence and familiarity with it. So we can see that by contemplating these 2, by how valuable this existence we have is, and how we will die, and at the time of our death, only our karma will matter, gives us the reason to practice the Dharma in this life. And then the second section on this is focused on the future lives. So there it says, by thinking over and over again, that actions are then effects unbetraying. So this means we need to contemplate the certainty and develop certainty in the law of karma. It's very hard for us to understand the details. Even the Buddha didn't explain because it was a waste of time to consider the exact ins and outs of karma. It's not entirely conducive to practice if you focus too much on what's the exact karma that will come from this action. Instead, we can be a bit more general and we can just think virtue leads to happiness and non-virtue leads to suffering. In this way, karma is very certain. So if we commit virtuous actions, we will definitely experience happiness as a result. So in this way, there are 4 outlines of karma we need to meditate on. The first is that karma is definite. Virtue definitely leads to happiness, and non-virtue definitely leads to suffering. And you can kind of find this one difficult to understand. When you see people in this life who have lots of happiness and things go well for them, but they're a very non-virtuous person, you might think, well, how's this the case? Surely if non-virtue causes suffering, they should be suffering right now, not happy. And there are kind of 2 approaches we can take to this, of that the happiness they're experiencing right now is the result of previous virtuous karma ripening and benefiting them. But we can also think about how, while we perceive them as happy, we don't know what their actual mind is like, and they might not be happy internally. So in this way, we don't really know how other beings feel. But we can think from our own experience in this life. When we can practice virtue, we maybe help other people or we do good deeds like that, it brings a feeling of joy. And also, if you are very kind and helpful to people, people will be kind and helpful back. So in that way, it's very beneficial. If people think you're a good person, they'll go out their way to help you. Whereas if they think you're a bit of a evil person or not particularly nice, they won't maybe be as open to helping you. And the second is that karmic imprints increase, and therefore the result is greater than the cause. So you can kind of think karma is like a rolling ball that's picking up dust and developing, growing, expanding as it grows. And this is because it forms a habit. If we're constantly practicing patience, your patience develops and grows, and you become more patient, and the virtue grows and continues to grow. In the same way, it's the same way in reverse. You see people that are very negative, and if they spend all the time complaining and being very negative and sad, they're constantly like that. They don't really snap out of it, and it just grows and grows. It maybe starts off with the complaint for half an hour a day, and then it grows to an hour a day, and so on. So in this way, it grows and develops, and they become more and more miserable to be around. And it's because they're habituating their mind to be negative. So if we habituate our mind to develop anger, we're constantly developing more and more anger, which means we're developing more and more non-virtue. So we have to be very careful here to do with habituation of our mind and the development of karmic imprints in it. And the third is that you'll never experience a karmic result that we did not create the causes for. So it's not that someone else, there's a slight aspect of sharing. If someone generates some kind of virtuous action, making butter lamp offerings, for example, and dedicates for you, it's when someone passes away, it's very common that we offer butter lamps for them and dedicate the merit towards their future rebirth. There's a little bit we can play with to do with the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and dependent arising there. But in general, the karma you experience, or the experiences you go through, is due to previous karma. And this is really common in the mind-only view. This is really well explained, or really elaborately explained, because they say that the experience of an object that is due to consciousness, it is due to karma, and it's due to previous habituations. You see something in that way. So because it's your mind from beginningless lifetimes, if you see it in this way because of karma, and it's karma related to your mind, it's necessarily got to be your karma. It can't be someone else's experience. It can only be yours. In the same way, if you think of like karma being in terms of cause and effect, This can apply to all of them, I suppose. If you plant a acorn, you'll grow an oak tree. That's certain. You cannot plant an acorn and expect to grow a lemon tree, for example. So in that way, it's definite that that seed will have that result. But also, if you don't plant a lemon seed to grow a lemon tree, you'll never grow a lemon tree. If you don't plant an acorn, you'll never grow an oak tree. So without the seed, you'll never have the result. And finally, the fourth outline of karma is that karmic cause is created and never lost. It's not like something you have to carry around in a bag. You can leave it sat on the table and you forget about it, that's it lost. The mental imprints that are always there. We can do purification practices and reduce them, but until you have a realization of emptiness, you can never remove the seeds and their imprints of negative karma. So then that's the first part of that. That's the first part of this half of the paragraph. The second says, and repeatedly contemplating the miseries of cyclic existence. So this is referring to contemplating the suffering of samsara. So we can share a couple of quotes first before we go into the details. So Lama Tsongkhapa says, if you knew how hard it is to acquire, living the average life would be impossible. If you saw its great benefits, you'd be sorry if it stayed meaningless. If you thought about death, you would make preparations for your future lives. If you thought about cause and effect, you'd stop being reckless. So in this way, Lama Tsongkhapa is really emphasizing the contemplations we've discussed so far. Thinking about how rare it is to have a human body, especially with the freedoms and endowments. Then you think about all these freedoms and endowments, how beneficial they are. Then we think about death and how it's certain and we're moving closer to it. And then we think about karma and how virtue leads to happiness and non-virtue leads to suffering. And from that, you practice the Dharma in a very pure manner. So we kind of covered the three main ones here, but if you think about how hard it is to acquire, this is not particularly covered in the three principal aspects of the path. But for this, you're kind of contemplating how few human beings there are in samsara compared to other beings. Thinking about how many realms there are, and we cannot perceive them all. But even the realms we can perceive, the animals, how there's 8 billion humans on this planet, and against how, there's countless times more animals than there are humans. So then, picking up on the sufferings. So there's a quote from one of the sutras where Shariputra says, "He eats his father's flesh and hits his mother. The enemy he kills sits on his knee. A wife gnaws on her husband's bones. Samsara can be such a farce." So Shariputra's saying here that loved ones. So in this story, what's happening is there is someone sat eating a fish that he's just caught, and he kicks his dog while he has his child sat on his knee. And he throws the bones of the fish to the dog. So the fish in this story, from Shariputra's omniscience, he saw the fish is this person's father, who he's now eating. And the dog was his mother in her past life, which he's kicking. And then his enemy that he's killed is now reborn as his child and sat on his knee as someone he cares about. And then the wife, the dog's gnawing on the fish bones. So you can kind of see that you have loved ones that are now strangers. You don't know that fish is his father. Or you can even inflict pain on loved ones, and enemies can become loved ones. There's just no way of knowing what's going to happen in samsara like that. So then the sufferings of samsara. So there are 6 general sufferings. The first is the suffering of the indefinite nature of samsaric pleasures. So any pleasure we experience in samsara doesn't last forever and eventually lost. We can see that, if we have happiness, it eventually has to end and we suffer. Especially if you think that this happiness is permanent. If you think you're never going to lose this happiness, when you do lose it, you suffer more. Second is the suffering of dissatisfaction. So if we're constantly striving for more and better samsaric pleasures, if you're not content, you're never going to be happy. You're always going to be wishing you had something better, and you're not able to enjoy what you have. The third is the suffering of leaving the body again and again. So being born in cyclic existence, it's certain we will die. And there's suffering at the time of death, It could be a painful death or just the fear of being separated from loved ones. It's a very scary time for people, so there's always suffering there. And the fourth is suffering of joining with suffering again and again. So this is to do with being reborn. When you're born, you're going to meet suffering again, basically. In fact, straight away, as soon as you're born, you suffer. Babies cry, you come out of this soft womb and then you're put onto what's going to feel like a rough towel to you and so on. Fifth is the suffering of rising and falling. So this refers to going through the realms of samsara. If you're a god, it's certain that you'll fall down to the lower realms, because eventually the virtuous karma you have will run out. You'll exhaust your karma to be born as a god and you have to fall down. And, generally you just constantly change realms due to various causes and conditions. You might go up, you might go down. It's just a form of suffering. And we'll expand on this suffering in a minute. But also, this again relates to death being certain, because you're going to die, you're going to experience rebirth in a different realm and so on. And the sixth is the suffering of loneliness. And this is common because, we're born alone and you die alone. There's no escaping this. So in this way, there's a lot of suffering we experience constantly in samsara. These are found in all six realms, all the realms of cyclic existence. So then when you meditate on suffering of samsara, you can start by contemplating the general sufferings, thinking about how you will be reborn, you're going to suffer at the time of death, you'll suffer when you're being reborn, and so on. And then you can think about the suffering of rising and falling, and then you can relate that to the different realms. So the hot hells, there's the 8 hot hells and the 8 cold hells. And you're basically starting off in the nicest and it progressively gets worse. So, like in the cold hells example, the first one is called the blistering hell. And that's because it's so cold, there's wind that gives you blisters on your skin. And the 8th one is called the enormous cracking like a giant crimson lotus hell. And that's because it's so cold and there's so much wind that your skin cracks and it goes such a dark crimson red colour from the cold and cracks into thousands of pieces and you experience constant agony. Then in the hot hells, you start off with the reviving hell. And this is an interesting hell. So basically you form 2 teams almost and you're just fighting non-stop. Then you get killed. And then there's a sound of a gong and everyone comes back to life and just starts fighting again and constantly repeat. So that's why it's called a reviving hell, because you're constantly revived. And you can think about this hell. This is quite an easy one to envisage, I suppose. And the traditional texts talk about people using swords and spears and things. But I've discussed this with a couple of geshes and a couple of other practitioners. And the actual root texts kind of talk about weapons. And because they also explain that the hells are created by your mind, we came to an idea that probably it's not swords anymore. These are going to adapt with the times, we think. So we think there might be people with swords and things there still, but you might also have guns and other things. So you can kind of see it's a very violent, painful, scary place. And the eighth of the hot hells is called the hell without spite, because it's just constant pain and suffering from being, heat, being crushed, and so on. Then there's the four neighboring hells, and this is basically when people have burnt off enough negative karma, they're starting to leave the hell realms. They move from the main suffering hells to these neighboring hells. And there's four. So one's called the pit of hot coals because they're trying to move to somewhere better, and they're having to like swim or wade through hot coals. It burns the skin and so on. There's one that's called the swamp of decomposing quicksand. It's similar sort of thing, but instead of being coals, it's like an acidic quicksand that sucks you in and burns. One that's called the hell of weapons, or three hells of weapons, and thinking that they're running through a forest, being chased by dogs, and these like sharp vines drop down and cut them, or they climb trees to escape the dogs, and the trees are very sharp and cut them. And then the fourth is called the acid river, and they're trying essentially going from the hells, and they can see the higher rebirth they want to achieve, and they just have to swim across the river, but it's a river of acid that burns. So you can kind of see how much suffering is involved in these hell realms. There's not a single moment of pleasure to be found. And then you can also consider the occasional hells. So this applies to like certain. This can be two types of temporary. So one being like when we experience great suffering in the human realm, that could be an occasional hell. And the other relates to sort of stories at the time of the Buddha. There was a butcher who said he couldn't abandon killing because he needed to look after his family, but he promised to the Buddha he wouldn't kill at night. So this butcher, when he died, was reborn in the hell realms. So during the day when he did the killing, he would be stabbed and cut himself. But then at night, when he took his vow not to kill, he was actually transported to the heavenly realms where he experienced great pleasure. So those kind of approaches can also lead to a mixture of realms. And then we have the hungry ghosts, suffering from heat, cold, hunger, thirst. That some cannot see food and drink at all. Some see it as food and drink, but it turns to feces and pus in their mouth. Some see it as food and drink, but they cannot fit it into their mouth. And some just can't see it at all. It doesn't even appear to them. And then other types of times, the hungry ghosts, it's said that when they look at a river, it dries up. And there are certain rituals can be carried out in non-Buddhist traditions where they beat the hungry ghosts to get rid of them because they can destroy crops and things. So they kind of suffer a lot being beaten that way. And there's the suffering of the animals, being killed and eaten, being ignorant and not really knowing what brings happiness. They suffer from heat and cold and hunger and thirst too, and also from being exploited and forced to work, like you see a lot in developing countries, especially horses and donkeys, things being beaten and forced to carry loads that are too heavy. And then human realm, there's the suffering of birth, aging, sickness, and death, the suffering of being separated from what you like, the suffering of encountering what you dislike, the suffering of not obtaining what you like, and the suffering that comes from having contaminated aggregates. So this is the eighth one, is the most important suffering to understand of being human. We can think through the other ones relatively easily. We all know we don't like to make things that don't make us happy, and we don't want to be separated from that which makes us happy. When the Buddha said, in regard to the Four Noble Truths, you should know suffering, this is what he's referring to, the suffering of having contaminated aggregates being in the nature of suffering. Of knowing that in cyclic existence, as long as we have ignorance, as long as we have contaminated aggregates, we'll never be happy. And then the suffering of the demigods, suffering from jealousy of the gods, so they go to war with them, or powerful gods and get killed and so on. And Jealousy alone just brings a lot of suffering. And then finally, the suffering of the gods. So whether it involves fighting and dying in wars with the lower gods, or when they die, their body starts to smell foul and rotten, so no one wants to be with them, and just kind of like they give off less light, and the jewels aren't as nice, and so on. So no one wants to be around them, so they suffer from being alone. And then they use their omniscience to see what's happening, and they see they're about to die, and they see where they're about to be reborn, and they generate great fear. So in that way, we can see the suffering of cyclic existence there. There's no lasting happiness to be found in any of the six realms. So then the final line says attraction to the appearances of future lives is reversed. So by contemplating karma and contemplating the suffering of samsara, will be one, motivated to commit virtue and abandon non-virtue, and two, most importantly, be motivated to escape samsara. So then we'll finish with verse 5, the definition of having generated renunciation. So here it says, when, by having trained in that way, there is no arising, even for a second, of attraction to the perfections of cyclic existence, and all day and night the intention-seeking liberation arises, then the thought of renunciation has been generated. So in this verse, Lamson Karp is telling you this, this is the definition of having a realization of renunciation. It's not that we cannot progress and generate bodhicitta and develop an understanding of emptiness until we have this realization. But if you want to enter the grounds and paths of whichever vehicle you practice, the Pratyeka Buddha vehicle, the Shravaka vehicle, or the Bodhisattva vehicle, without a direct realization, or without this valid cognition of renunciation, you cannot enter the paths. It's the beginning. So you enter the Shravaka paths by having uncontrived renunciation. And you enter the Bodhisattva paths by having uncontrived renunciation and uncontrived bodhicitta. So you can see that this renunciation is key. And as will come up next week and in the future, you cannot generate bodhicitta without renunciation. So basically, we need to practice and meditate constantly in this way, contemplating the drawbacks of cyclic existence all the time, till eventually it becomes habitual in our mind stream. We no longer see cyclic existence as bringing pleasure. So that there concludes the section on renunciation, and kind of covers everything I was hoping to cover tonight, perhaps even a little more. So yeah, it's really beneficial that now you've heard the teachings, you go away and you contemplate the meaning and think, was that correct? Does it accord with what I've heard before and what I've studied and so on? And then you apply it in meditation. And that way you use the three higher trainings. So, the contemplation, so hearing, contemplation, and meditation to generate this realization. So if you practice well in that way, you'll progress and have a very pure Dharma practice. So we can take some time if there's any questions. And if it's not, we'll just dedicate the merit we've accumulated. So it's always important that every Dharma activity we do begins with setting a motivation, and then that motivation begin the practice, and then when we finish the practice, we dedicate the merit we've accumulated. So in that way, we recite the dedication prayers, thinking that the 3 rounds here, so the the virtue we're dedicating, the act or the person that is dedicating, the act of dedicating, and the aim we're dedicating towards of empty inherent existence, so that they're necessarily the nature of cause and effect. And as we've seen tonight with karma, they are certain and will increase, so they will come true. That's why it's important we generate a very vast dedication. We don't just dedicate for may this merit last until tomorrow. We say until all beings attain enlightenment, because it grows and develops for that much longer. So Dagi Jine Sape Gewadi Tendan Dawa Kunga Gampe Dan Kepa Jetsun Losang Japa Yi Tempe Nimpo Rindu Selze Shore. And the two bodhicittas. So we'll actually also recite the renunciation, because that was what we focused on today. So Nechung Sampa Rinpoche Make Panam Kegyuchi Kepa Nyampa Mipa Yang Gongye Gongdu Pelwa Sho. And bodhicitta Jancho Samcho Rinpoche Make Panam Kegyuchi Kepa Nyampe Mipa Yi Gongye Gongdu Pelwa Sho. And emptiness. Tongni tawa rinpoche make panam kegyuchi kepa nyampa mepai gongne gongdu pelwa sho. And finally, for the long life of His Dalai Lama, Gangwe we kowe zinkam so pendan dewa malu shumwe ne chenwe ziwang tenzing yasui shape site badu tengyuchi. Thank you so much, and see you next week.